All right, hello, it's Big Cheds. I'm back with another episode, another chapter of my battles with cancer, a candid patient and caregiver's memoir. This is my story fighting cancer and taking care of my mother when she had cancer, and now mourning her loss after she passed. I published the book on Amazon. It's available along with my other two books, Trading Quotes and Trading Wisdom. Those are also available on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle paperback and Audible version. But I want this one to be completely free for anybody who it might help. So I'm recording it one chapter at a time here on YouTube at Cheds Trading. Of course, I'm Big Cheds on Twitter. We are at the aftermath. We're in part 3. Mom just passed, and now we are going to be dealing with the aftermath. The aftermath. Driving home from the hospital, I was completely numb, singularly focused on driving safely so I could get some rest. I knew that Mom had passed by now or was passing during that very moment, but I did not want to think about it. The fact that I left just beforehand allowed me not to think about it until I was home safe and sound. And once I got there, I crawled under the covers and I slept and woke up a few hours later in complete shock. My sister indeed confirmed that Mom had passed, and the gravity of the moment hit me like a freight train through a brick wall. Everything I had done to help Mom stay alive had failed, and now I had to deal with what life would be like without my source of life, as she put it. It was as if I were drunk as I stumbled around the house, unsure of what to do or where to go. I was afraid to touch the emotion, to touch the feeling. I was afraid to look deep inside and to explore what it all meant, because that was far too much to bear. I had no taste for anything. I had no sense of right or wrong, up or down, or what anything meant to me. I was without a compass and lost at sea. Recognizing the difficulty of the moment, I wanted to push myself to write, hoping that I could work through some of what I was feeling. I also wanted to make progress on this cancer memoir, which had meant so much to both Mom and myself. However, the absolute magnitude of those raw emotions made progress slow and labored. So, after a while, I decided to distract myself and take a break. World War II in color. World War II in color was ready to go, and I sunk right into the backstory of some battle for life and death in a French village. Thinking about the suffering of so many people throughout that war helped me as I pondered the passing of my mother. Later that day, a good friend came by to visit, and it was a test of my fortitude in that I had to put on a good show. I had to be at least somewhat social with my guest, despite the circumstances. As the visit progressed, I found our conversation to be soothing and a welcome distraction. We flowed back and forth for most of the time, able to avoid discussing the heaviest of heavy issues at hand. One of the many epiphanies that came to me during our talks, the one that jumped out the most, was that I needed to get on top of my emotions as soon as possible. That way I could be strong for Mom's funeral. I had no idea when the funeral would be exactly, but I thought that it was important for me to put on a good face and to represent our family proudly. Absolutely adamant on speaking during the service, I believed that I could tell uplifting and heartfelt stories about this wonderful person. And by doing so, I could connect with and perhaps help my family. Mom's friends, and myself in the process, struck with grief. As a way to soothe myself, I imagined that I had a great role to play. Everyone knew just how close Mom and I were, so they would be looking to me for some perspective. On the heels of this tragedy, I was searching for purpose and meaning, and this eulogy was some modicum of purpose that would help me to get through at least the next few days. Once my friend bid me well and went home, I returned to my work on this book, and I again found the task too difficult emotionally. The hang up was that I kept thinking about how she was alive and well just weeks ago, and when I closed my eyes, she felt so real to me. Losing Mom was so big that I could not even begin to define its parameters or begin the process of understanding my emotions. Once I had given it some thought, I finally decided to listen to a few of her voicemails. And again, I was struck with how real she seemed. I could feel her personality and remember her so vividly. The concept of Mom going away forever seemed so strange to me. After listening to a third voicemail, I thought to myself that I could always remember her like this and could evoke a connection with a voice recording, and that way she would never really leave me. And although it was still too raw to listen to more than 3 recordings, I knew that over the coming days and months, I would be able to listen to many more, and I hoped that that might help me heal. Laying down for sleep, I closed my eyes and I hearkened back to the image of Mom holding my nephew just before I woke up, and I saw that she was no longer breathing, and I asked her to visit me again in my dreams that night. The following day was my appointment for that dermatological test, the one that I had to take as a result of my genetic disorder. This appointment was at a smaller hospital to the main one, the one that I'd been going to for my other tests. And by now, I had spent so much time at the old hospital that I knew every nook and cranny, and so it took me a little time to find the right office at the new hospital. The nurse checked my vital signs and confirmed my medical history, and then the doctor walked in and greeted me. After we went over my medical history, he began a physical examination using a small magnifying device. He looked at every mole and abnormal-looking growth on my body, one at a time. This doctor moved with precision and speed, pausing only twice to point out things he had found. In one area, there were 2 moles that he told me to keep an eye on to see if they changed in shape or color. And in a second area, there was a mole that he wanted to remove and test. And even though he said it was unlikely to be malignant in any way, it was better to be safe than sorry. On the way out, I happened to share the elevator with a man in his 50s and a petite woman in her 60s. And it seemed to me that they didn't know each other personally, but they were still having an interesting conversation. They were sharing recollections of different places they had lived in the state and why they had traveled to this hospital for care. The older lady lamented that she still lived rather far away, but she came there because of the quality of care she received. And the gentleman agreed, and he shared a story about coming there for an open heart surgery a few years prior. What happened next was the most interesting part. As we approached the ground floor and the doors started to open, the lady mentioned that she had gone to this hospital a few years ago to treat her cancer. And stepping out into the foyer, I jumped into the conversation and I told her that I had done the same. In response, she mentioned her prior non-Hodgkin large B-cell lymphoma diagnosis, the exact same type of cancer that I had. And then she told me she had gone through R-CHOP chemo, followed up with Neulasta. And I told her about my regimen, R-CHOP, followed up by radiation. When she asked how long I had been in remission, I told her a year, and she proudly stated that she had been in remission for 14 years. This lady warmly smiled at me and told me to get to 14 years as well. It made quite an impact on me to run into someone who had dealt with the same cancer I had and was this far along in her journey. That gave me a shot of hope. A few days later, I returned to my hometown to start organizing Mom's house, and I had been dreading doing so for a while, as everything about that house reminded me of Mom, and I was in such a fragile state. Ever cognizant of my emotional needs, my wife took some time off of work to meet me there so that I would not have to face the challenge alone. As I had for the prior times I visited the house while Mom was at the hospital, I called out her name, mostly out of habit, but also as a way to comfort myself. And even though I knew she had already passed, there was a tiny part of me that was listening to hear if she called back. That would seem to suggest that I was in a bit of denial and hoping to wake up from a bad dream. Poking around downstairs and then in the basement for a while, I sifted through boxes of my childhood belongings, and I reflected on memories of a different time and place when everything was much more simple. And during this process, I encountered endless photos of friends and relatives, and most importantly, I found photos of my mom at various stages in her life. It was a really strange experience to see her as a young girl posing with her sisters, as a young woman going off to college, and then a little bit older as she met my dad, and then with my siblings and I as young children. I had seen many of these photos before, but now that I knew how the story ended, I was looking at them in a different light. I was reevaluating the meaning of life. Seeing Mom as such a young and vibrant woman touched me, and I wondered how it all came to this, where she passed so suddenly and far too soon. Walking around the yard gave me great joy, and I examined various trees I climbed as a youth, and I reconnected with the grass and earth itself beneath my feet, having played on it so many times. After taking a quiet moment to breathe in the fresh air and to enjoy the beautiful nature around me, it was time to head home, having accomplished what I needed to with this trip. As I drove home that day, I reflected that it was not as difficult as I imagined it might have been to be there at Mom's house after her passing. And though my emotions were invoked while rummaging through each room, I was still able to keep them in balance and able to push forward. And that gave me a small bit of courage. That evening, while I was back at home and trying to decompress, I received a call from my dad, and he wanted to check in and see how I was doing. Now, just 3 days since Mom's passing, I reported to him that I was doing fine and trying to stay busy by working on my projects and playing video games. And although I was absolutely devastated on the inside, on the surface, I was doing okay. And I felt almost guilty for not crying in that moment. My aunt called me a little bit later that day, and it was more of the same. And by observing my own behavior during that call, I was struck with how normal I seemed. After both of those phone calls, I thought about the fact that it's so hard to stay in that moment of tragedy all the time. especially when someone is emotionally numb. I realized many months prior that this book, this cancer memoir, was a great therapy tool for me to work through complicated feelings and dynamics. And with Mom's passing, I knew that I would need to lean on the writing and editing process to sort out what was going on inside my head and my heart. Part of me wanted to keep pushing to work on this book, but it was far too hard to do more than a paragraph at a time. At this point, I was transcribing notes from my time in the hospital with Mom, and it was just heartbreaking to put down on paper the hope I was feeling while holding her hand, only to have that hope later smashed into a million pieces. Despite the difficulty of the effort, I knew that it would be vital for my long-term emotional health. So I pushed through and I continued to work on this story. For the next few days, I more or less stumbled around the house, emotionally exhausted and without an internal compass. My body felt heavy as I was bizarrely dragging one leg as I walked around the kitchen in circles. I was neither hungry nor sated, but was more so inebriated with grief. The grief I felt was deep down inside, and when I attempted to examine it, I was blasted as if from the backdraft of a blazing inferno. Trying to understand what it all meant was impossible, and my gut reminded my anxious mind that it was still too big to understand, at least not now. At night, when I was feeling brave enough, I listened to a voicemail or two from Mom, and when I became overwrought with emotion, I picked up the laptop and I tried to funnel some of that energy into a positive direction, working on this memoir. While I was going through Mom's address book to help compile a list of people the family should contact after her passing, I was reminded of just how many folks Mom had connected with over the years, especially how many close friends she had. It was an interesting exercise as well, in the sense that I wondered what others would think about my address book after I passed. As I continued to mourn, I could not take my eye off the ball with my health. And I was scheduled for colonoscopy and upper endoscopy in just 3 days, and I had to begin the preparations. Again, one small silver lining that I had found was that Mom's cancer had helped me discover my genetic disorder, and that would perhaps save my life down the road. For as long as I could remember, people had been telling me that the hardest part of a colonoscopy was the preparation. So I was not looking forward to it, despite the absolute necessity of the procedure itself. My wife dutifully read information online, and she digested everything the hospital had sent us, and then helped me to plan my diet from 3 days out. I had to stop eating anything high in fiber, and this included fruit, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and corn. Then, starting the day before the procedure, I had to switch to an all-liquid diet. I could still have some things like coffee, but it had to be without any milk or cream. Jell-O was fine as well, as long as it was not red-colored. I could also have some chicken bouillon if I was feeling hungry. There was a specific schedule of when to take certain medicines, including a stool softener and Miralax. The Miralax was taken 14 hours before the procedure, and then, again, 7 hours beforehand. I had to wake up at 2:30 in the morning on the day of the procedure to take that second half of the dose. Early on in my cancer odyssey, I had to drink 2 bottles of barium sulfate before an MRI procedure, and that was absolutely disgusting. So I was prepared for a similar experience with the Miralax, and to my pleasant surprise, when I mixed it with Gatorade, it had almost no taste, and it went down smoothly. I had the last of it in the morning, and then I went to the hospital at 7 o'clock for the colonoscopy and upper endoscopy. After checking in and filling out some paperwork, I was taken back to a room. The nurse escorted me through a swinging door, and I feasted my eyes upon perhaps a dozen hospital beds. Each bed had an IV machine behind it and machinery on the walls to monitor a patient's vital signs. There was also a simple curtain that could be drawn as needed for privacy. It was unavoidably traumatic for me, having just spent all that time with my dying mother in a similar setting. And even though it was uncomfortable, I had no choice but to muster on and brace myself to complete the procedure. What I was doing was absolutely necessary and would probably save my life down the line. The nurse handed me a hospital gown and told me to change. And when I was ready, she came back and she hooked me up to the IV machine. Then she inserted into my nose the exact same clear plastic tube they had given Mom when she first started having issues with her breathing. And right away, I understand how uncomfortable it must have been for Mom. That tubing was intrusive, as my natural reflex was to reach up and to pull it out. And it reminded me of the many times during Mom's final days when she would reach up her hands to mess with that tube. Myself or other family members would have to stop her from pulling it out so she could continue to breathe. I laid there patiently as the nurse connected me to a blood pressure and oxygen monitor, and I glanced up at the numbers on the machine, much as I had done while desperately watching my mother slowly die. What a strange feeling it was to be drawn back into that moment so soon. Despite that sensation, I had to fight the urge to become tense as I was about to undergo an important medical procedure. After checking my vital signs and giving me a basic saline solution through the IV, the nurse wheeled my bed from the prep area into a larger room where the procedures would be performed. And before I knew it, I was waking up, told that the procedure was finished. I couldn't believe it, but I was relieved nonetheless. In the days leading up to it, I had experienced a fair bit of anxiety about what the procedures would feel like, so I was glad that it turned out to be no big deal. As I laid in the recovery room, I felt woozy but relaxed, and ever so slowly I began to get my bearings. A few minutes later, the doctor walked in and handed me a printed out report, and he explained that the upper endoscopy had gone well and there was nothing of concern. The colonoscopy had also gone well, but there was a polyp that needed to be removed and tested, and the doctor wanted to biopsy it to make sure that it was not cancerous, and he said that he would have those results in about 2 weeks. Earlier that next week, I received a call from the dermatologist's office, and he let me know that the mole that was removed was not cancerous. However, he explained that it was indeed atypical. He said that some of these moles do continue on to become cancerous, so he wanted me to return to the office to cut out the surrounding tissue. I didn't mind going back to have that done, and I was pleased to find out that the mole itself was not cancerous. The following day, my daughter had to stay home sick from school, and since I work from home, I was able to take care of her. It's never easy when your child is sick because they are vulnerable and you're always worried about their well-being. Coming upon the heels of watching my mom slowly die in the hospital, it was really hard to watch my daughter's health suffer. And some part of me wondered what I would do if she got worse. The next day, she was still sick, and though she had a temperature and seemed generally sluggish, the pediatrician told us not to be alarmed as she was still in good health. Sorry about that. As I held my daughter in my arms to comfort her, I told her that everything was okay and that she would be just fine. The same things I had confidently said to her all the previous times when she had been sick. However, something was different this time as I realized that those were the exact same words I had told my mom, and she didn't make it. Thinking about it that way messed with my mind, and I again realized just how precious life was and how little control I really had over anything. Thankfully, my daughter got better and she was able to return to school the following Monday. Once I dropped her off, I went back to Mom's house to get some cleaning and organizing done. And it was nice to be back there again soon and to be able to reconnect with the place that I loved and that meant so much to me. I took great pride in the fact that I was making progress cleaning and organizing the house, but in truth, the work was only just beginning. Towards the end of my visit, I decided to take a slow walk around the yard, looking closely at each bush, branch, stone, and stump, as if it might be the last time I saw them. Again, I felt that it was critical for me to take in and savor the experience, knowing just how important that yard had been to me growing up. As I made my way back towards the front yard, I encountered some people walking down the street. I saw a short woman with someone who seemed to be her daughter, and they asked me if I was a family member. When I told them that I was the son, the older woman offered me her condolences and told me about some of her experiences with Mom. The mother mentioned that they had moved into that neighborhood a few years prior, and they had often seen Mom working in the yard or while she was out taking her afternoon walks. This woman told me just how kind my mother had always been to her. It meant a lot that she had always shown genuine interest in her life, and it was a tiny consolation to have this stranger offer her fond recollections about my recently departed loved one, but nonetheless, it was still nice to have further affirmation of the positive impact that Mom had on others. Though my sisters were doing the bulk of the funeral preparations, I was still involved in some ways, and I had a planning meeting later that week with the Reverend and my older sister. I was eager to meet this woman, as I had never heard of her before, and I wanted to know more about the person who was going to preside over the services of my loving mother. Trying to put myself in her shoes, I could not imagine what it must be like to be in charge of the funeral of a complete stranger, with so many grieving folks looking to you for compassion and wisdom. And my conclusion was that this woman must be incredibly brave and likely had a strong presence about her to be able to handle such a task. The meeting took place in a small building just adjacent to the church, and I arrived a few minutes early. And soon thereafter, a splendidly dressed woman in her mid-60s with shaggy gray hair and solemn brown eyes walked in, and she introduced herself as the Reverend. Having been so curious about this woman's appearance ahead of time, I think I set myself up for disappointment, as she was just another friendly-looking lady. My sister arrived, and by then the Reverend had settled in, and she was ready to engage with the task at hand. The three of us gathered around a large and well-used mahogany table designed for 8 or more people, and with all that room, the three of us had plenty of options as to where to sit and where to spread out the papers we had brought with us. the amount of distance between us, I believe, was a good thing, as the subject at hand was so raw. Having complete control of my surroundings was comforting to me, and I assume was for them as well. My sister and I went back and forth, sharing our recollections of Mom, many times lining up, but other times differing as well. And it was those moments which I found the most enlightening. I kept reflecting upon the fact that it was so difficult to describe to a complete stranger, someone that you know so well. All that you can do is haphazardly piece together a mosaic of remnant memories and generalized emotional imprints. Thankfully, while organizing Mom's house, I discovered a brief autobiography she had written many years prior, and we were able to offer that to the Reverend as a way to add Mom's voice to the choir. Returning home from that meeting and back to my life, over the course of the next few days, I spent as much time as I could with my family. Everyone who was still in my life had become that much more important to me now that Mom had passed. My wife and child especially so. I did my best to stick to a normal routine despite my emotional state, making sure to take good care of myself by eating right and getting enough sleep. Acutely aware of the potential of letting my emotion push my life in a bad direction, I wanted to avoid that fate. It was important for me to look and to feel healthy for that funeral that was coming up in about a week. I was still in a great deal of shock from watching Mom pass. And though I was slowly dealing with my difficult emotional experience through the process of writing this memoir, some things were still too raw to think about. My sisters were angels, and they took the lead for the funeral preparations as well as writing the obituary. And when they reported to me that it had been completed, I could not even open the email to read it. Despite the fact that I was working feverishly on a eulogy, there was a disconnect where I did not feel emotionally ready to read the obituary. 5 days after her passing, I was still not ready to think about her death in that way. And that made me think that I might be more depressed than I was letting on. As the date of the funeral itself approached, I found myself becoming emotional, much in the same way as I had in the days leading up to my chemotherapy sessions. Despite the fact that I was working on the eulogy all week, I still had been able to push aside many of the difficult emotions I was experiencing. And now I would have to face them to be ready for the funeral. It was really important for me to proudly and, in my view, properly represent our family, and to do so in a way that would make Mom proud, so everyone could see what a great son she had raised. The wake was held in a local funeral home, one that I had passed by many times before while running errands and really hadn't given much thought to. It was surreal to step foot inside that building now as Mom lay there peacefully, knowing that I would never look at or feel about that place the same way again. Similar to perhaps the way I had felt about working in the emergency room, I also wondered how the gentlemen in suits who ran this funeral home were able to deal with grieving visitors day in and day out. Perhaps they were immune to it by now. Before the wake began, my wife and I were worried that it might be too traumatic for our daughter to see Grandma laying there in the open casket. However, when the viewing time came around, my wife was the one who broke down crying, and my little daughter had to console her. Seeing our daughter react that way made me proud and gave me great hope that she would continue to handle the passing well. To prepare ahead of time, we read her some books aimed for children, named The Invisible String and Water, Bugs, and Dragonflies, and it seemed as if those efforts were paying off. My siblings and I took turns standing guard near the door to greet those who came to show their respects, and I was pleasantly surprised with both the number and variety of people who showed up. And I ran into several individuals who had only known while growing up. Many of them were parents of my schoolmates, whose faces I recognized, but names I could not remember. A large group of Mom's former colleagues also came to express their condolences, and they shared with me stories that helped me paint a more clear picture of Mom's life, a part that I had only heard about from her. The funeral itself was beautiful and well attended, and I was touched by what so many, including my siblings, had to say about Mom and the impact she had made on their lives. My comments were themed on the concept of is versus was. It's common to talk about someone who has passed by saying they were a great person or they were a great mother, but in my mind, they always will be those things. Those personal qualities are eternal. Just because they are gone, they do not lose the things that made them who they are in life. Those memories and imprints of our daily experiences will live on with us. The service seemed to go by fast, and then it was all over, with myself and the other family members lined up to meet those who came to celebrate Mom's life that day. Some of my closest friends came to show their support, including the one who had recently lost his mother. And it was only in that moment that I could truly say to him that I understood some of what he was going through. After everyone paid their respects to the family members, Mom's casket was wheeled down the aisle and towards the front door, set to be taken to her final resting place at the cemetery. As it slowly made its way past us, my daughter leaned over and kissed the casket, gently saying goodbye to her grandmother. It was an incredibly touching moment for my wife and I. An older lady standing next to us also shared that moment and remarked how brave my daughter seemed. On that cold and windy day, we drove to the cemetery in a long, slow procession, proud and solemn with the gravity of the moment. As this small group of family members and close friends gathered together to say a few final words, I was faced with the finality of my mother's passing. She lay in that casket and would soon be returned to earth. There was nothing I could do but accept what had happened and make my peace with it, just as Mom was prepared to lay in peace for eternity. After the burial, we set off to meet up with a large group of folks at the home of one of my mom's closest friends. I got there a little bit early, so I was able to scope out the house before everyone else filed in. And upon entering, I was pleasantly greeted by a small catering team, working feverishly to arrange a salad station, a sandwich station, and various appetizer trays, as well as opening up red and white bottles of wine for the guests who were soon to show. It was touching to see that so much forethought and planning had gone into the reception. And just as I was starting to feel pretty good, I ran into a massive photo of Mom that had been blown up and placed on a poster board near a seating area. Seeing this photo jarred me. Even though Mom looked wonderful as she smiled and seemed full of life, I was struck with the juxtaposition to now when she was gone. it felt like it was unfair that she was not with us and enjoying the party. As the guests began to arrive, I stepped outside to get some fresh air, and I took a few moments to myself, and I wondered quite seriously if I would be able to handle small talk, given my mental state. After a moment of contemplation, I bit the bullet and I went back inside. The food was great, the wine was fine, and Mom would have loved the party. She really would have. Folks were gathered around in groups, sharing remembrances and catching up with each other. The guests also enjoyed a wonderful photo album my sisters had put together of Mom throughout various stages of her life. I found the event overall to be a healing one. It was nice to spend time with folks who loved Mom as well, but I kept thinking about how everyone would be going home soon and I would be left with my misery. From my shattered worldview, it seemed like life was moving far too fast and I was not ready for everything and everyone else to move on and return to normal. Following the funeral and the reception, I spent most of the next few days in bed, finally able to catch up on some rest after weeks of hectic and traumatic activity. Each time I woke up from a nap, I found myself stunned and incapacitated from shock, unsure of how to proceed with my day other than focusing on family and work. Since Mom's passing, people would ask me how I was feeling, and I found that words were inadequate. So much so that I considered taking a vow of silence so I could mourn her in peace. On the surface, there were many great things going on with my life, but I could cry at a moment's notice as the dark undercurrent of my pain was never far away. About a week later, I got a phone call from the genetic doctor's office, and he reported that the polyp they had removed was completely harmless. I was in the clear. Now, with a solid baseline of positive results from the skin test, colonoscopy, and upper endoscopy, I was in a good position to stay on top of my genetic disorder going forward. However, even with this clear baseline, I still had to commit to some lifestyle changes to reduce my further risks. A few days later, I received a call from the social worker who had spent some time with Mom during her chemotherapy sessions. And she was reaching out as a follow-up to a conversation we had just shortly after Mom's passing. This kind lady asked me something that really stuck out. She asked me, "Have you been able to gain some perspective?" Her question really caught me off guard because I was still living with the loss so closely, especially while I worked on this book and relived almost daily all the painful memories of Mom's hospital stay. Responding, I told her that it would have been impossible for me to have already gained any real perspective since I was still dealing with the loss day in and day out. Truth be told, I was surprised she would even ask me that question. She knew how close Mom and I were and how little time had elapsed since her passing. That being said, her concern seemed genuine, and I took the question as an opportunity to verbalize some of what I was feeling, and afterwards I thanked her for reaching out. Once I hung up the phone, I thought more about what she had said, and I wondered, how might I find the perspective that I so badly needed? How does one begin to deal with the loss of someone who loves you that much? Well, I planned on gardening, fishing, spending time with friends and family, and taking good care of my health. I wanted to do things that made me happy and allowed me the opportunity to live in the moment. Next chapter is perspective. This is my battles with cancer, a patient and caregiver's candid memoir. This is my story as I fought cancer, survived cancer, took care of my mom as she fought cancer, and mourned her passing. This book is published on Amazon along with my other titles, Trading Quotes and Trading Wisdom. Most of you know me from Twitter at Big Cheds. I'm reading this book on YouTube at Cheds Trading for one chapter at a time. I want the whole thing to be free for anybody who's going through cancer or knows someone who's going through cancer or dealing with a loss. And that's why I'm doing this. So it's my honor to be here. And I thank you for being here and listening. I will be back with another chapter soon. Take care.